Nick, my brother from another mother, what's going on?
Hey, yeah, not much, man.
How
Just
are
enjoying
you?
the lockdown experience.
Oh yeah, what's not to love? You know. um, so my mission is to actually do what we're doing, get what we're recording right now, and actually put it on the internet. That's the goal, because we've recorded one. We did it last week. It was a great one. I thought it was one of our better, you know, Martin Luther and the plague and pestilence and everything.
Best things we've ever done, no doubt.
Well, no, I legitimately think it was actually one of the best ones we've done in the series, right? And the video didn't record. The audio sort of got half recorded. The rest of it's like terrible quality. So I'm going to put it out. I'll let everyone know. If anyone's tracking with us to this extent, you'll notice we didn't do anything last week at all, and that's just because I felt kind of sleepy. You know,
Wasn't it your day last week?
It's true. It was my birthday. Yeah, I actually, it was all in the name of trying to get me a day off on the birthday. So I just kind of bailed on everything. But we did record. So I got one in the bank that is coming. I'll put it on the audio. So if anyone's listening to this right now or watching this, then go and check out the actual podcast. You know, the Podbean audio thing. And that'll come out there, some bonus content. I would recommend checking that out because that was great and really helpful. Hopefully we get that out. Hopefully I get organized enough to get that edited and out before the pestilence and plague is over, you know, which would mean it's lost its relevance. But I thought that was really, really good. All right, so we're sort of committed. If you're joining us for the first time, if you don't know who we are, Nick is a pastor from Timaru in New Zealand. That's on the South Island. Yes, there are two little islands within the one island of New Zealand, and Nick's right there on the bottom. I'm on the bottom of the top, and we're two pastors in New Zealand. And basically, why I'm saying that is to introduce, who we are, but also just to say we're not coming at this thing from any sort of scholarly perspective, but we want to commit to kind of read some of the, just the literature involved in church history, some of the greats. And the reason this will be valuable to you is just if you want to stop talking about it and read it. You know, there's a great intro, a little splash into it. Obviously, there are lots of great books on each one of these books that are written. Scholars who've dedicated their lives to helping you understand more of the context. There's more you can look at, but it's kind of like, where do you start? A lot of the time, you know, I mean, you read church history. That's one. You get a 1-volume overview, and then you've got all these places you need to go. You realize there is a lot of great literature out there, and you've got to start somewhere. So this will hopefully help you just hear some of that literature, and actually from the horse's mouth, so to speak. That's not our mouths, but you know, the actual the text that we're reading. And then, you know, what we're wanting to do is just do what we do with everything. Really, every time we talk, every time we connect, we're always talking about things from our theological perspective and bringing it over, and so. Make it fun, make it something that you do. And that's why it'd be worth joining us for that. So please do. And, whether you are at this point just going to stop the tape and go and look up what we're looking at and reading with us. Not the tape. It's not a tape at all. It's definitely not a tape. It's like a podcast.
Okay, boomer.
Yeah. It's like it's on your phone. It's a MP3 or it's a video. It's an MP4, but you know what I mean. And we are looking today at John Chrysostom and his famous one, the Priesthood, which is great for pastors, pastoral ministry, and it's one of the first pastoral deals. It's kind of like a Reformed pastor before Reformed pastor, you know?
Yeah.
And so, we got to know about this. And Chrysostom, of course, one of the more accessible of the early fathers, and was one of the big preachers, and has so much in common with the kind of ministry that we're typically engaged in today, whereas other fathers seem very foreign and just, wow, what was their context? At least, Chrysostom was systematic expository preaching. He was committed to a very literal approach, or at least just not a very fanciful allegorical method. So it was part of that Antioch school in that sense. And what else can we say about this guy? I mean, it's just he's a good guy to know, and so I'm quite excited to just read through this little brief snippet this evening.
Yeah, so maybe a few fun facts is after Augustine, he's the most prolific church father whose extant writings we have.
Yeah.
So sermons, 200 letters. So Augustine takes first place, John Chrysostom takes second. He's one of the top 4 in terms of doctors of the church, along with Basil the Great, Augustine. John Chrysostom takes one of those top spots. Fun fact was he was a very popular preacher in Antioch. He used to preach against riches. He was on the side of the poor. He was doctrinally down the line. And he got kidnapped to become the Archbishop of Constantinople because the leader there thought it would be a politically good move to have the best preacher in the country or the best preacher in the church in the capital. And he submitted to it.
Man.
And so what actually happened was, he was this ascetic guy. He had a mentality to everything, didn't tone down his preaching at all, upset the upper classes, wouldn't go to their shindigs and their fancy parties. And I think it was the empress herself that tried to basically get him cut off from the church.
Totally. Well, they did. They exiled him, didn't they? They just and then he came back for a brief period, and then I think he died under exile, if I'm not mistaken. Like, it was just a brutal exile. Yeah, what a deal. It's kind of how I feel about making people pastors in New Zealand. I'm like, come on, just get it. I'm going to capture you, bring you down to New Zealand, and just plunk you in that church, go, instead of looking for this cushy career.
He reminded me a bit of John Knox. I was reading one of his quotes, just to say, don't go to the Wikipedia page for John Chrysostom.
Okay.
All it does is it talks about how he was anti-Jewish, anti-gay,
oh my goodness,
pro-poor. It's just like doesn't discuss one doctrinal distinctive. Stay away from Wiki.
All right.
Christianity Today has just a very useful short article. If you want to Google that, that's worth digging into.
Excellent.
But one of the quotes that he said was, just digging at the rich, is he said something like this: you regard your excrement so highly that you receive it into silver bowls when your poor brother is starving.
Yeah, wow. Beautiful. Like, and that's why they called him the Golden Tongue. Yeah. Oh, man. Wow. Yeah, I mean, I've always just felt like, I remember first time I looked through the Church Fathers, it's quite a scary experience, when you first go there, because you're like, what on earth are these guys even on about? They're just so different from anything you're even, coming towards or from, and then you find Chrysostom and you read some of his stuff, and for one thing, you can understand it. It seems like it's just very devotional and warm. And for another, as I said earlier, it just, he was very much against that whole allegorical approach. So it just feels a bit more evangelical, at the end of the day. And not to mention the homily style kind of book by book thing that he's usually on about. But he also wrote about these topics. And so, one of his most famous was the Priesthood, which was really all about this issue of caring for souls and so forth. And so I think probably one of the things, I mean, it's a big, we're just going to take two. Well, let me say this. What version have you got? Have you got did you get it on your?
I'm just reading from the Schaff one, the Kindle version.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. So yeah, Nick's using that one. You can get that online or on Kindle, Philip Schaff's Church Fathers. So if you want, just stop, go find it, come back. Press play and let's go together. Or just if you're on a treadmill right now or doing your thing or, just hanging out, just hear the words, get a little bit of a taste of what Chrysostom sounds like. Not actually, but you know what I mean? As we read him, we're not going to try and put on the accent. I mean, what would that be like? That would be like a Greek accent, right? It'd be like
Afrikaans accent.
Yeah, like definitely doesn't sound like a weird twisted South African accent like mine. But anyways, all right.
Well, maybe just before you dig in, just a little context on the book. So Chrysostom was approached for the priesthood, and the first time he was approached, he turned it down.
Mm-hmm.
And so book one is all about a discussion with his friend Basil and John were, sort of wanting to go. Basil really wanted to go into the priesthood, and John was like, well, I'm not worthy to go into the priesthood. And there's this long conversation about, well, why didn't you tell me you didn't want to go in?
Right. And also just the whole, like, shouldn't we just do the contemplative life instead? And, isn't that better? And, and there's the whole big war about, because he started off just basically living in the desert, right? I mean, he was one of those guys. He's just been, and he damaged himself like big time. He was, he just, these guys are so crazy. I mean, he just sort of as a young guy, headed off, did the monastic life, but he messed himself up by the time he actually came back into civilization.
But standing was one form of fasting.
Wow.
Didn't lie down, didn't sit down, just stood.
Can you believe it? Yeah. They were just made of something else, I'm telling you. But anyways, so as you say, you know, they're on this conversation and like, is it better to do this? Is it better to do this? And that part's like kind of, it's super interesting, you know, because it's just not even what we would talk about today. But the conclusion that he comes to, I think, is great in that basically, you know, it is a good idea to not go into that secluded lifestyle, but even though it's more, you know, he regards it as a more perhaps it's easier or it's more personally sort of gratifying in some ways. At the end of the day, the public life, pastoral ministry is going to be that which is, you know, a higher calling. Ultimately, it's going to be something that is not for yourself but for others, and he lands there, which I think is, you know, I mean, I'm reading that stuff, I'm still battling with that. I could still just go into the, you know, not my desert, but, you know, my little isolation internet, you know, like library vibe, and I think a lot of people feel that way. You know, we love books, we love just studying. We could easily retreat in some ivory tower, you know, and we know as pastors that's definitely you know, people do that, but it's part of the pastoral calling. It's a high calling to not do that and not feel that you're short selling anything in the process. So I think that alone, it's just at that greater narrative level in their dialogue with Basil. It wasn't the famous Basil though; it was his personal friend, right?
I couldn't discover that. I tried to do a bit of reading on it. I didn't find any detail.
I didn't think it was the same guy, and he wasn't even known or anything, but by this you know, that's what I think anyway. All right, let me hit the first paragraph. Did you have anything else you wanted to add by way of context?
Maybe just to set the context, he's talking about pastoring through difficult pastoral situations. Mm-hmm. It's all about shepherding and the use of the staff, and, you know, the balance between how hard do you have to be and how soft do you have to be. So just to set the context that way. So. Totally.
Oh man, I like it too. And you know, there's some Two Kingdoms stuff in here as well on that point, you know, which is great. All right, let's look at this. So I'm on the third, what is it, paragraph?
Book 2, chapter 3.
Chapter 3, right. And my translation will probably be a little bit different, but let's work with me. As regards human infirmities, in the first place, it is not easy for the pastor to discern them, for no man knows a man's thoughts except the man's spirit within him. 1 Corinthians 2:11. How can anyone apply the remedy for a disease whose nature he does not know, often indeed being unable to understand it even when suffering from it himself? It causes him yet more trouble when it does become clear, for it is not possible to doctor all people with the same authority with which the shepherd treats his sheep. As with sheep, it is necessary to bind wounds, restrain from food, and to cauterize or cut. But with human beings, this requires the cooperation of the patient, not just the will of the doctor. That wonderful man, he's talking about Paul there, perceived this when he said to the Corinthians, not that we lord it over your faith, but help you for your joy. And that's 2 Corinthians chapter 1:24. For Christians, above all, are not permitted forcibly to correct the failings of those who sin. Here's the Two Kingdom angle for me. Secular judges indeed show their authority to be great when they capture criminals and prevent them, even against their will, from following their own devices. But we have to improve wrongdoers by persuasion, not by force. For neither have we been given legal authority to restrain sinners by force, nor, if it had been given, would we have any scope to exercise it, inasmuch as God rewards those who abstain from evil voluntarily, not of necessity. Consequently, we need much skill both to induce our patients to submit willingly to the prescribed treatment and even to be grateful for the cure. For if anyone struggles when he is bound, which is in his power, he makes his condition worse. And if he should pay no heed to words of warning, which cut like steel, he inflicts another wound on himself by his contempt. Thus the attempt to heal only becomes the occasion of a worse disorder, for it is not possible to cure a man forcibly against his own will. There we go. And that's the end of mine.
Wise pastoral advice.
Isn't it great? I mean, it's just, and I've made that mistake so many times, like, I mean, this is like the number one young pastor mistake. And, like when I say young pastor, I mean like just over that ridge, right? But it's like, it's just, you want to fix it, you want to fix it. There it is. You see the problem. You get the guy's side, it's not going to be loving if I don't, deal with this thing. So you call the brother aside and listen, man, I see this in your life. This is what's going on. And, it's not there. It's not the kind of response you were looking for. So instead of just being patient, the servant of the Lord must not strive. And perhaps the Lord will grant repentance.
Shout louder, push harder.
Exactly. You just like, listen, my hammer's obviously not big enough. Let's grab a bigger hammer for this nail. It's every problem is a nail, and you only have a hammer. Again, I mean, obviously, when we think about this by way of the Inquisition and Roman Catholic and the civil authorities and two kingdoms and all that, that's where it gets super interesting as well. But even just on this everyday pastoral thing, there's a word here. You've got to be able to. It's not like a doctor. I love that point that he makes. It's not like you can just get in there and cut it out. And put the guy to sleep and cut it out, and I think that's an important point to make, because so often the pastor's role is wrapped up together with this kind of physician of the soul, and there are all sorts of faulty sort of comparisons that come out of that, and I think probably lead to some of these problems. It's really very different like that. Even what I was thinking the other day, where you have the evangelist who hey, the appeal, if you saw someone in a fire, burning in a house, would you just not go to them, or would you just simply, tell them the gospel and then walk away, or would you grab them and throw them over your shoulder and run out of the house? And now in the fire, of course, you're going to deck the guy, you're going to throw him over your shoulder, he's going to get out of there, and he can thank you later, right? That's simple as that. But you really, firstly, the whole thing with with an unbelieving perspective there is that person wants to be in that house. It's really, if anything, they are not even willing to let you come into that place. So you've got a completely different paradigm. And so, you just don't have the ability. You shouldn't. I mean, you can't. It's basically Christendom and Inquisition to say, well, I'm going to force you to become a Christian and get out of this house. I think Augustine made it like that sort of point. He was like, well, if it comes down to someone's soul and they're burning, then use a little bit of force. And, that's the dawning of the Inquisition. So you basically got to stay well away from that idea. And, it seeps in there.
I mean, what I really resonated with was sort of I felt that distinction that we make between the legislative and the declarative nature of our authority pastors.
I love it.
So it's more persuasion than trying to really pushing the issue. I just the verse that came to my mind was 2 Timothy 2:25. Here's verse 24. And the Lord's servant must not be quarrelsome, but kind to everyone, able to teach, patiently enduring evil, correcting his opponents with gentleness. God may perhaps grant them repentance, leading to a knowledge of the truth.
He quotes that in the next thing. So it's directly on his mind, which is great. Good to know. He was onto it on this stuff.
And then another verse that would be relevant would be Galatians 6:1. Brothers, if anyone is caught in any transgression, you who are spiritual should restore him in a spirit of gentleness. Keep watch on yourself, lest you too be tempted.
And the other thing is that, and I've gone through this little thing as well, it's constantly walking in between these two, in that you're like, all right, fine, I give up. I'm not going to be that guy. I'm not going to, be gentle, do whatever. So you sit down with the person and you're working it out, and it's very frustrating, and you're not getting the response you were hoping for, and you're using all your persuasion, and it's just not working. And I think what I've seen, and what has triggered me, I think, to go in that overzealous way sometimes, is I've seen pastors become so like resolved to just, it's not me. Yeah, I mean, they're basically going to flip or not, and I'm just going to go in there with the info, and if the info doesn't work, well, what can you do? I'm just going to go home and have a cheeseburger and go to bed, kind of thing. And the reality is, there's something missing there as well.
It seems to me to be a form of hyper Calvinism. because
Right.
you're neglecting means. You're saying, well, I'm just going to plant the truth. It doesn't matter how I say it, as long as I just put it out there.
Right.
And I don't have to dress it up. I don't have to add any sauce. I don't have to be persuasive. I don't have to be patient.
Right.
I just sow the seed, walk away. And if they don't get saved, it's all their fault.
Right. And the word will do its work, brother. And, you just let put that word there, and then you walk away. And like, I mean, there is something about that we are saying you should have that confidence in the word, without a doubt. But I mean, I love the fact that this is Chrysostom saying it, the silver-tongued preacher or the gold-tongued preacher. This is the guy who speaks of the great need for rhetoric and the great need for skill in persuasion, and sees that as an important part of it, and yet is the very guy who's saying, that's where we leave it. So it's almost like, it's a helpful thing to be able to go, listen, your tool here is persuasion. All right. So you do need to go in there and you need to try your best. And if you're unskilled in persuasion, according to the scriptures, if you're unskilled, you're basically not as fit for the job as you could be. But once you've put your best case forward, and it's really not a matter of you having been unclear or have lacked persuasion, then that's it. I mean, then you can walk away with a confidence that you haven't betrayed your post, so to speak. And I think, that's an important dynamic, that it'll get you sort of balanced. If a lot of people will listen to that and go, oh my goodness, I'm really not trying, I'm going into those meetings that I'm just trying to read the Bible verse and go home, or preaching, I'm just got my word, I'm going to read it and I'm going to go back into the vestry, and that's the end of that. But what we're saying here is, no, that's not going to cut it. There are means. You've got to go for it. That's not what he's saying. But there is a way. I mean, when you've preached your sermon, you can sleep like a Calvinist, and that's good. And when you've had that conversation with that person, it's not dependent on your persuasion. Ultimately, it's not dependent on your skills and abilities. And there's a mystery there, but it's true. It's one of those things you got to hold in tension.
Yeah.
Good.
Cool. Should we look at next chapter?
Let's do it.
So this one's slightly longer, and I'm not sure where yours cuts off. I know you've got an abridged sort of version, so I'll just cut off where I think, just before the conversation part.
Yeah, right. Okay, that sounds good.
Cool. So chapter 4, book 2.
All right.
What then is one to do? For if you deal too gently with him, who needs a severe application of the knife, and do not strike deep into one who requires such treatment, you remove one part of the sore but leave the other. And if, on the other hand, you make the requisite incision unsparingly, the patient, driven to desperation by his sufferings, will often fling everything away at once, both the remedy and the bandage, and throw himself down headlong, breaking the yoke and bursting the band. I could tell of many who have run into extreme evils because the due penalty of their sins was exacted. For we ought not, in applying punishment, merely to proportion it to the scale of the offense, but rather to keep in view the disposition of the sinner. Lest, whilst wishing to mend what is torn, you make the rent worse, and in your zealous endeavors to restore what is fallen, you make the ruin greater. For weak and careless characters, addicted for the most part to the pleasures of the world, and having occasion to be proud on account of birth and position, may yet, if gently and gradually brought to repent of their errors, be delivered, partially at least, if not perfectly, from the evils by which they are possessed. But if anyone were to inflict the discipline all at once, he would deprive them of the slight chance of amendment. For when once the soul has been forced to put off shame, it lapses into a callous condition, and neither yields to kindly words nor bends to threats, nor is susceptible of gratitude, but becomes far worse than that city which the prophet reproached, saying, Thou hadst the face of a harlot, refusing to be ashamed before all men. Therefore, the pastor has need of much discretion, and of a myriad eyes to observe on every side the habit of the soul. For as many are uplifted to pride, and then sink into despair of their salvation, from inability to endure severe remedies, so are there some who, from paying no penalty equivalent to their sins, fall into negligence and become far worse and are impelled to greater sins. It behooves the priest, therefore, to leave none of these things unexamined, but, after a thorough inquiry into all of them, to apply such remedies as he has appositely to each case, lest his zeal prove to be in vain, And not in this matter only, but also in the work of knitting together the severed members of the church. One can see that he has much to do. For the pastor of sheep has his flock following him, wherever he may lead them. And if any should stray out of the straight path, and deserting the good pasture, feed in unproductive or rugged places, a loud shout suffices to collect them and bring them back to the fold, those who have been parted from it. But if a human being wanders away from the right faith, great exertion, perseverance, and patience are required, for he cannot be dragged back by force, nor constrained by fear, and must be led back by persuasion to the truth, from which he originally swerved. The pastor, therefore, ought to be of noble spirit, so as not to despond or to despair of the salvation of wanderers from the fold, but continually to reason with himself and say, peradventure God will give them repentance to the acknowledging of the truth, and that they may recover themselves out of the snare of the devil. Therefore the Lord, when addressing his disciples, said, who then is the faithful and wise servant? For he indeed who disciplines himself compasses only his own advantage, but the benefit of the pastoral function extends to the whole people. And one who dispenses money to the needy or otherwise succors the oppressed benefits his neighbors to some extent, but so much less than the priest in proportion as the body is inferior to the soul. Rightly, therefore, did the Lord say that zeal for the flock was a token of love for himself. Did yours stop around there?
That's where mine stopped, right there. Yeah.
Great.
Beautiful.
Wow.
Yeah, wow. Great.
Talk about a very wise pastoral sensitivity.
Beautiful.
You know, he's not measuring the situation according to a rule. He's approaching each situation sensitive to the individual that needs to be ministered to. He hasn't got a cookie cutter and he's just forcing a principle onto every situation.
Excellent.
He's looking at this person saying, what's their personality? What's their background? What's the level of addiction that we're dealing with here? You know, do they have a lot of pride, or are they able to humble themselves?
Right.
It reminds me. Sensitivity.
Yeah, it reminds me a little of Francis Schaeffer's whole thing. I've mentioned it frequently, but it just sort of struck me with that same. It's that same sense of sensitivity that comes through, and that it's almost just a shocking thing to hear when you hear Francis Schaeffer say, "Well, listen, when you're talking to that unbeliever, just be gentle with them, and just realize if you push too hard, you could take their entire worldview away, and then they'll be in despair." It's just like not at all the way you're processing things usually, but that's the same thing. You've just got to be careful, and you can take each one as they are and be able to.
I don't know if you've seen this in your own kids, but I see it in mine. I've got two boys and they love to argue, and the one will just push his point and he will argue and argue and argue, and the other brother is basically being shown to be at fault and wrong, and he was the inferior intellect at that particular moment.
Right.
And the other one just rubs his nose in it until the other one's tapping out for mercy, mercy, mercy. And it's just like this relentless, I now have the upper position, I'm going to bring the full weight of myself down upon you.
Yes.
And we just milk the situation for all it's worth.
Exactly.
And I mean, that's a sinful tendency of the heart.
Yeah, it is. It really is. Yeah. And you see it sometimes. I mean, I know I'm sort of veering onto apologetics and debates now rather than pastoral engagement, but the two are kind of related at some level in that. And you see this often with that, having to win the debate vibe, it just gets weird at some level. And I think where it becomes a pastoral thing is that, and I've actually seen this, like there was that guy, I can't remember his name now, but quite a well-known apologist, presuppositional guy. He planted a church, and the church sort of grew very quickly based on his ministry. If I remember the guy's name afterwards, I'll put it in the show notes. And this is not he himself tells the story, so I'm not moving over his privacy there, but he planted the church, and by his own admission, it just went, it grew really quickly because he had some sort of platform already. But he drew to himself people like himself who like to win those arguments and were good at winning arguments. And he said actually the church, like it just exploded. Or like an implosion or something. It just ate itself up. He said it was terrible. It was absolutely, within a few years, it was just, he was seeing a mirror image of his own attitude there. And it was not working in a church environment. I mean, it was just with his pastoral activity, with with the way he was leading, and then the way people were basically following, and he learned from their lesson, and so forth, and the rest of his story is still to be told. But I think it's just a powerful illustration of this idea, and that you have to really be careful of that, it's as you say, it's that sinful tendency. You get into a debate with someone. It could be about some matter of doctrine. Even you could even be right on it, and you could still be wrong in the way that you've won that argument or the way that you pushed it over someone when it wasn't really the issue at play. It wasn't really what they were actually struggling with. A wise pastor would have seen that, would have penetrated a little bit deeper rather than force a stupid, periphery issue, even if you were right on that point. And so things like that become very important to the health of a church, I think. I mean, more and more I'm realizing that as I go.
Just one of the things I've had to say to my sons, just watching these conversations and arguments, is you have to let the other person be wrong with their dignity intact.
Yes. Oh man, I remember you said that to me a while back, and I think that it struck me. I remember thinking like, that is so true. Wow, and what a difficult thing to do, right? I mean, how do you, just
let me show you every way in which you're wrong, and I'm just gonna. The way in which the Lord deals with my own conscience towards me, I'm going to now turn the magnifying glass on you and just try to destroy.
Yeah.
We're horrible that way. I don't know if you do this in your mind, where maybe you're having an argument with someone, or you've seen something that's wrong, and you put yourself into this role as you role play, and all of this righteous anger comes up inside of you, and now you're emoting. The person's not even there. The situation's not real, but you're angry right now.
It's the headspace.
We wear it. We get into it. I'm in there. I'm with it. I'm acting it up. And as soon as we get into a conversation where we now hold the moral high ground, boom.
Yeah, it just comes out.
It trips.
Yeah. Yep. We talk about marriage. We talk about everything. We're talking about everything. Oh man. So
that's when it comes down to win the person, not the argument. That's where the gentleness of Galatians 6 just really struck me. The spiritual who are among you. So that's talking about the mature with gentleness, with an eye on your own sin. I don't know if I shared this illustration with you. There was an old pastor and a young elder who'd just come onto the eldership, and they were going to someone's house. A man had been caught in adultery. Mm-hmm. And so they were just outside the door, and the older man turns to the younger man and he says, do you think you could ever commit this sin? And the younger man says, never. And the older man says, well, then you can't come.
Wow. There we go. Beautiful.
Go.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that would be this is the older man who knows the sinfulness of the heart, who knows how to influence people.
Yeah. No, that's that's such a great point. And and just I love what I think it was right on the top of here. What then is one to do if you deal too gently with those needing a drastic application of the knife? So that's what struck me, because you see it there. You're in some situations you can see the thing that needs to be dealt with. It needs to be removed. It's not like you're delusional on that point, and that's what makes it so difficult sometimes. And he says, the application of the knife, and either you're gonna not cut too deep, which is so counterintuitive.
Just remember, this is the day before anesthetics. This is not general anesthesia. This is the patient's awake with nothing.
Yeah, right.
And you, as a doctor, go drilling into their arm. They're screaming at you while doing it.
Yeah, right.
So you're really feeling the tension of how deep do I go?
True, but I mean, I think from a pure, the way I understood it anyway, from a pure medical perspective, you'd have to be some sort of sadist, if you were a doctor back in the day, anyway. But you're sort of just going, listen, I'm gonna. I got to cut this thing right out. It was just going to come back, or it's going to be, double the problem later. And it's a very counterintuitive thing to be able to say, well, I'm just going to cut a little bit out so it helps you now and leaves you basically intact. And yet he's saying there's something to that when maybe a physician wouldn't think that way. But a pastor does need to think in terms like that, where you can't, if you cut this whole thing right out right now, you're going to leave this guy in ruins, and that's not really ultimately what you're about at that point. It might be a worthwhile thing to think about, a half incision or whatever the analogy would be at that point. You can tell you do not want to let me near a knife. It would not go well. But I thought that was a really profound point. And, often it is, he says a little bit later on, otherwise, while wishing to mend what is torn, you make the rent worse. And in your zealous endeavors to restore what is fallen, you make the ruin greater, right? I mean, that's basically the issue. I've done that. I've been guilty of that. You know, it's really your zealous endeavors is pretty much exactly.
I've seen that at Gloriavale with the heavy shepherding.
Yeah,
this
right.
very rule-bound, very restrictive environment. We're just told you're going to go to hell all the time. They just tighten down on the rules. They bully your conscience. And after a while, it becomes cauterized. They just don't feel a thing.
Right.
And they're able to just be brazen in the face of any authority, even if it's not Gloriavale anymore, because the damage has been done.
Right.
Because people push too hard with them.
They've had to come up with some sort of coping mechanism. Yeah. Oh, man. Anyway, so it's important stuff. And
yeah, great. Very sensitive.
Very good. And so hopefully that gives just a little bit of a taste of Chrysostom. And what a dude. What a good dude. Who we got next? Let's have a look. Oh, Ambrose. We're getting onto it now.
Oh,
my goodness.
And then Augustine.
Yeah, probably Augustine coming soon after that. And
so Ambrose was the guy who was preaching when Augustine was sitting under the word. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, because I love the story that, you know, and he was, even though it was like really not what we agree with now, but he was just basically, you know, coming out of his, his Platonism at that point, and just the only way the Christian faith could be a viable alternative was if it was allegorized to death, and so Ambrose comes along with these like hyper allegorical method, and Augustine is just like, this could work. I like this. And he gets into it. It's just crazy how God uses all that stuff. Anyway, cool. So that's hopefully you're stoked. You stuck with us to Chrysostom, and stick with us as we move forward in the series. Thanks a million, Nick. Appreciate it.
Cool, man. Take it easy. Right. Cheers.